Hi, this is Doug May, and welcome to video 4 in our video series on Hydro-Quebec's perspective and where the proposed Churchill River projects fit into the Quebec hydro puzzle. In today's video, what we want to do is to focus on royalties and rents. And just to give you a heads up, this is an extremely important part of the puzzle. And it's important because, for the most part, water, which we'll discuss in a moment, is the most important input into the generation project at Churchill Falls. Is worth almost nothing. Okay, so let's get started. In a previous video, we mentioned that there are a series of inputs that are needed to produce energy at a hydroelectric station. So the most important input, at least in the media and in the public discussion, has been capital. That is the actual dam and the turbines which are needed to produce the electricity. But we also need labor, and there are a couple of other inputs such as purchase materials and purchase services. But the important point is that these are relatively fixed in the short and the medium term. Obviously, they can be changed in the longer term since we're thinking of putting new infrastructure projects into play here. The variable input in all of this is the water flow. And this flow can be controlled on an hourly, daily, and seasonal basis, depending on what the demand for electricity is. But we also know that it can be limited at times because of the drought, as is the case on the La Grande Riviere in Quebec. And that's really the problem that Quebec Hydro is now facing. Well, it is water then that has the essential production value. But water costs, at least in the terms of Churchill Falls, cost almost nothing. It is this low cost of water then, including the amount of electricity which Quebec has available to it that comes from Churchill Falls, that plays the primary role in explaining why electricity costs in Quebec are the lowest in Canada and the G7. Now, I made the claim that water costs for Churchill Falls are basically nothing. What evidence do I have to support that claim? Okay, so I looked at the final annual report for Churchill Falls, which came from Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, as you can see in the source down at the bottom here. And so I looked at their annual statement and said, okay, let's look at the consolidated statement of profit and comprehensive income. And I've highlighted it here in yellow for you, the expenses in 2024, and this is in thousands of dollars, but let me put it in millions, $113,963,000. Okay? So that's a fair amount of expense for the year. So what part of that were made up of water royalties? Well, here you see the water royalties were almost $9 million, $8,790,000 in that year. How does that compare to some of the other expenses they have? Oh, look at this. Some of the other expenses are salaries and benefits are over $43 million. Maintenance is $12.7 million. Relatively, water isn't that expensive. You know, when you look at the expense per kilowatt hour, what does it work out to? It's not 1 cent. It's not 0.2 cents. It's 0.025 cents per kilowatt hour that CFLCO pays the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. Well, what about Hydro-Quebec? What do they pay the government of Quebec? Well, the answer to that is about $9 per megawatt hour, or 0.9 cents per kilowatt hour. And remember, that's indexed each year, and it changes around January the 1st. I guess you can verify that. The important point here, the government of Quebec receives approximately 36 times more per water royalty per kilowatt hour than the government of Newfoundland and Labrador does. It's really, for Hydro-Quebec, a very cheap source of power. So no wonder they want to use the Churchill River and maybe use the same water royalty rates, although we've been informed that they will be modernized, whatever that means. The point is, like so much of the information, the specifics are really unknown to the general public. There are different ways that we could set water royalties, although this is a complex matter. What happens if we base water royalties on production the way that they do in Quebec? And they've got the rate, as we just mentioned, at $9 per megawatt hour. Well, then this would give the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, for the Churchill Falls power production, which I'm going to assume is about 34,500 megawatt hours annually. That would give the government of Newfoundland and Labrador about $310.5 million annually. It would go directly to the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, wouldn't go to CFLCO, though we would presume that CFLCO would add this as an expense and pass along to its Newfoundland and Labrador hydro customers. Another alternative is for water royalties to be based on sales values, but this can present certain problems in CFLCO's case. Why? Because Hydro-Quebec is basically the only buyer of power from Churchill Falls, takes over 90% of it, and therefore we're getting into monopsonistic market issues. That is, the price that CFLCO gets is basically determined by Hydro-Quebec. But we have to remember that Hydro-Quebec is a cost-minimizing public utility, which has been written about that it's been involved in the dissipation of rents by the government of Quebec to households in order to impact its equalization payments. So because Hydro-Quebec does not take it as a profit, then it isn't included as revenue of the government of Quebec, and therefore the government of Quebec seems poorer than it actually is. So the overall impact of this, if we based it on, and we base it on the wholesale value of electricity in Quebec, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador would receive very reduced royalties. Another way we could design Royce royalties would be based on rents. And so here there are two basic resource rent principles, differential and scarcity rents. Initial way of doing it is to concentrate on differential rents. But the differential rates, although they be preferred in this situation, the problem is the price at the generation gate, that is, where the price that CFLCO charges from Churchill Falls, it's not set in a competitive market. As we just mentioned, it's set in a monopsonistic market. The other thing we'd have to do is to have the price adjusted in 2041. So you might have it set each year. It might be indexed, but it's you would use it to encourage Hydro-Quebec to undertake the other projects which might be worthwhile doing, that is Gull Island, the enlargement at Churchill Falls, and the upgrade to the turbines at Churchill Falls. A valuable piece of information would be the unit cost of the lowest cost new facilities that can produce exactly the same amount of power as a proposed infrastructure project, such as Gull Island. Now, I've asked Newfoundland Labrador Hydro for this information. I think it was back in February, but I'm still waiting for the answer. The problem still remains that we want to capture the seasonal changes in the process and the prices that occur in the free export markets. And so the resource rents, if you're looking at the price in a more competitive environment, it would change from month to month. The bottom line here is that this requires a lot of thought and discussion, since the proposed Churchover projects operates in a market environment which is much more complex than the simple theoretical models commonly discussed, which are discussed in microeconomic theory. Well, that ends our short discussion on water royalties. I'm sure there'll be changes to some of my videos, and hopefully we can get into some other videos as information becomes available. Perhaps I'll have some opinions on that. Anyways, thanks so much for watching this series of videos, and don't hesitate to send along your comments or ask questions, and I'll try my best to answer them. Have a good day.